Hey guys, what's up? It's BigJackFilms here, and welcome to another audio commentary during the March of Kong. I am basically here to discuss today the commentary for probably one of my favorite videos I worked on, which was Kongfrontation, a Tribute. This came out, I believe, say 2013, 2014, I can't remember off the top of my head when I released this. But this is obviously a tribute to probably my all-time favorite ride or attraction at any theme park, which is Kongfrontation, which opened from 1990 and closed in 2002. This was a ride I remember fondly from my youth, the first time I visited Universal Studios Florida. Now, the first thing I should mention is I made this logo by basically, I had to speed up this old promo for Universal Studios Florida a bit, and then put the classic 90s Universal Studios, logo, like there in the music by James Horner, to make it look kind of cool and everything. So, yes, this is obviously the remaster of the old video, because the old video, looking back on it, I wasn't too proud of, so I went ahead and remastered and fixed it up a little bit for, last year, actually, during, 85 Years of Kong. So, my history with the attraction is interesting, because I remember the first time I visited Universal Studios Florida was back in 1998, I want to say. And I was completely captivated by the whole idea of a film studio and making movies and writing the movies and everything. So a lot of it was, so seeing Kongfrontation for the first time, it really kind of reintroduced me to the character of Kong, essentially, because I remember growing up, I watched the original and the 70s remake and King Kong Lives. So going on this ride, first of all, this ride scared the crap out of me as a child. Just seeing Kong and kind of the purple lighting, because this was at the time when they changed the lighting in the mid-90s of the ride. So it really scared the crap out of me. I remember the banana breath. I remember just how terrified I was. And then, essentially, I basically, I did the ride once, and it was nice, and I remember the photo op and everything in the gift shop. Then I went back in 2000 and rode it again, and I still was scared. I'm not gonna lie, I was still scared shitless. But then, come around the time when YouTube started to come up, and I really started to get back into Kong again, I took huge interest in this ride. And I discovered it was a lot better than I remember it being, and unfortunately by the time I caught wind of everything and kind of got back into it, the ride had closed in 2002. Now, during the reason I came up with this, I created this video, was actually because this, I think I started to work on this around 2011, 2012, and at the time, they had just announced that Jaws would be closing at Universal Studios Florida, another ride I remember fondly, and I can remember, essentially, like, being really pissed off about that, so I decided, screw it, I'm going to start paying tribute to these old rides that we used to love. So I started editing this video around I want to say 2011, when I visited New York City for the first time. So I just started by collecting footage off YouTube and compiling into one film. Now, obviously, one of the biggest remasters was recreating the pre-show. Now, to this day, the pre-show has yet to ever be released. I mean, you can get the pre-show for Jaws, Back to the Future, and so on, but nothing for Kong, unfortunately, and I love what they did here with the ride, where they basically had the WWOR New York news channel with Ronald Smith actually do a fake report on Kong's rampage. So finding a lot of the footage of the pre-show in order is basically impossible, but I managed to dig out as much as I could. When I usually go on YouTube and stuff, I usually look into the latest of people who post old school Universal Studios stuff, and what I'll do is, the best footage, honestly, in my opinion, is not just the separate videos of each ride, but also, you go on YouTube and you can find tons of old home movies from families who visited the parks from the Golden Age, and you can essentially, like, find the best footage of the attraction, surprisingly, and other rare stuff in there. So, digging through a lot of that stuff was really cool, and just being able to see all the footage of some of the best the ride had to offer. So, yeah, basically, another thing about this ride that I've been kind of, interested in is where all the props and stuff went, where a lot of the stuff went. Now, very quickly, one of the things the ride did that I loved was that they used footage from Kong 76 to illustrate what happened prior. And so, it was fun to kind of go and look at the get some HD footage of the movie and then implant the WWOR logo there, which I just used a McCleary effect for that, and I was trying to replicate a shot like that. So, finding a lot of the props in this ride is a little difficult. The closest thing I know of what happened to the majority of the Kong pieces, the two animatronics one of them was completely scrapped and recycled, and the other was actually, parts of it were sold on eBay, and I actually know a few private collectors who own some of the Kong fur and so on. So, there's that, but the main one that actually is really hard to come by now is the photo-op Kong, and it's rumored that and a couple other props were actually, they're in a storage unit in one of the backlots, abandoned backlots in Florida, so I would love to see them pull that stuff out and build kind of a museum to the old parks. Now, to add the realism, they actually did include, like, promos and stuff during the news reports, so a mix of this footage was essentially old footage from the ride, but also footage from the King Kong encounter at Universal Hollywood, because that's really the only version that's around. So basically it was kind of splicing it all together into one thing. So it's kind of suggested that both rides, both Hollywood and Florida, take place in the same time frame. So it's just interesting to see that all kind of come together. Like, the storyline plot-wise is my guess is that Kong attacked the Universal tram first and then turned over to the Roosevelt Island tram in Florida. So, it was just fun kind of collecting all this footage from YouTube and so on, because honestly, like, looking back on this ride, it's sadly, like, a lot of people only now recognize it as an iconic ride, because it was the crown jewel of the Florida park. Really, there's only a few elements remaining in the building of Kongfrontation. There is the doors, obviously, that are there, obviously. A lot of the structure is still there. If you go on Revenge of the Mummy, there are a few things to note about. One being, in the treasure room, you will find a golden statue of Kong, and it's a very unique piece, and honestly, I want a replica of that golden statue. I would love to put that on my shelf. Another thing is, some stuff in the Revenge of the Mummy, is that some of the Egyptian scriptures actually formed Kong's face, which is interesting. As well, the remaining tracks of the Roosevelt Island tram are still on the ceiling, and the reason that is because if they had taken it out, the whole building would have collapsed. So they're permanently there for whenever they decide to just keep the soundstage in there. Another rumor, it's kind of hit and miss if it's true or not, but there's rumors that because in the ride they had Kong's footprints in the ground, there's rumors that on the floor of Revenge of the Mummy, you can still see the imprints of Kong's footprints. Now, there's a big rumor that apparently one of the heads of Kong are in underneath the launch bay of Revenge of the Mummy. That has come out as completely false. There's no evidence to suggest one of the Kong heads is there, and there's been nothing that has said that in terms of, like, Easter eggs. So it's really hard to tell. Now, actually, one of the Roosevelt Island trams is owned by a private collector. It's just been kind of hard to track down at this point. Now, doing the remaster, it was great to come up and find new footage of the ride, like POVs from the front of it and the hosts of the ride, which, I know it's interesting because I run a Kongfrontation Facebook group, and a lot of people who worked on the ride are actually really cool to talk to. So it's really interesting to kind of get their perspective and stories, because, like, for one thing, the tram would actually, because it was leveled where it would go all the way up and all the way down, there was always a chance that the tram would just straight drop like an elevator, plunging to the floor, always a chance of, hurting guests. So there were, aside from the fact that people think Kongfrontation closed because nobody was interested in it, that is false. It was mostly due to technical problems. There were a lot of technical issues with this ride. Now, comparing King Kong Encounter and Kongfrontation, I will say Kongfrontation is better because two animatronics, as well as better set design, I felt. Like, it's better replicated here. Now, actually, funny enough, having visited the Roosevelt Island tramway recently and riding it on the Queensville Bridge, I can verify that the ride here is a miniature compared to the actual thing, because you go on the actual Roosevelt Island tramway and the Queensville Bridge, which is really the only way to experience Kongfrontation now, in terms of reenactments, is it is way higher up, and it's a lot more smoother, and there's no way that Kong climbing that thing would be able to reach the tram, honestly. So this is really much, like, it was pretty much lower scale than to what the legit place in New York City is. So yeah, I just basically had to use as much footage as I could to replicate the ride. Some of it was promotional material, some of it was home movies, some of it was POVs. But it's just really great. I love this elevated tram set. It's really cool to see. They have a legit train that they just stuck into there. I love the whole ambulance thing as well. Like, the lighting's great. The design of the sets are great. The water constantly spewing. Like, it must have been a wonderful set to just essentially walk into if you decide to go on the ride on foot. And what's also interesting, speaking of which, it's interesting to see that, like, a lot of the soundstage was actually used as a Halloween Horror Nights thing for a couple of years. And what was cool about it, you could go under the Queensville Bridge and see Kong overhead. It was a very rare experience, but apparently people could have actually done that. So as I was saying, like, there's a lot of people who worked on the ride, and they always had great stories to tell. And while we're at it, if you guys want to see more photos and videos of Kongfrontation, I'll put a link below to my Facebook group. It's entitled Kongfrontation, a group for the Eighth Wonder and other Universal Studios attractions. We post a lot of rare photos and videos from the rides, and I try to post at least twice a day, so you can definitely check out some stuff there. Now, over the years, the ride did go through several updates. When it first was released in 1990, as seen here, the explosions were massive on the ride. They were, like, huge explosions. As well, the lighting was different. Like, from 1990 till 1995, the ride had a much more kind of reddish color, red-brownish color to it in terms of the lighting. But come 1995, to save costs, obviously, for one thing, the power in the facility was completely cut back. The explosions were less, like, fiery, and as well, the Kong animatronics, obviously, were limited to movement, but also the fact that the lighting changed. They changed it from a brown, kind of hellish red to more of a purple-blue, which also gave Kong a much interesting color that is seen in the promotional material. Like, here you can see it's a lot more blue, and that was pretty much because of the added on lightings in 95. So in these versions, he's a lot more darker scene to hide a bit less of the movements, as well as essentially giving him his more distinct color than you see in the promotional material. One of my favorite versions of the ride is the footage seen here from July 8th, 1993, because they had used the John Barry score from the 76 film to illustrate the ride as a whole. So when I was doing this tribute, I obviously used a lot of John Barry's work, but also over time I actually did obtain a couple of the tracks from the soundtracks from the ride, and unfortunately, like, there's only like one or two. It's not the complete soundtrack. But it was just interesting to kind of compare the two, and the soundtrack used in the ride was more based on Max Steiner's work from the original. So it was more because to fit the theme, I was using the scores from Max Steiner and John Barry to kind of combine the two into one. But that was really interesting, because yeah, this ride is essentially based on both the original and 76, but more on 76. I love that shot right there. That was actually from a promotional bit that some company had. I found, like, the promo material is actually a lot better than, like, the home movie stuff. But yeah, so I just love the way this version of the ride was essentially the footage that one of my favorite versions of the ride. They had, like, pretty much captured what I remember as a child pretty damn well. And man, what I would give to have been an employer on this ride. I would have loved every second of it. It would have been the best job I would have ever had, aside from YouTube, obviously. So, yeah, it's just, I think it's hard to choose which animatronic I like more. On the one hand, the full-scale animatronic that was used in the bridge scene, which is called the Bridge Kong, was a full-scale creature, whereas the Street Kong in the later scene is only half the character. But I believe the Bridge Kong was actually a lot lighter than the Street Kong. The Street Kong was actually, like, heavier. I can't remember really the pounds of how much they weighed, the two puppets were, but if you want more detail, definitely check out my Kongfrontation review. So I remember when I was a kid, when I rode this thing, I was on the side where the Street Kong was, and I just remember just being super terrified of it, and I believe I was pretty much at the back of the tram. That's the farthest I remember. I was in the back of the tram, and I was on the side where the Street Kong was. Now, that footage there of those actors, that was actually from there's another attraction in the same soundstage called the Universal Studios Screen Test Adventure, and there, guests could essentially be on green screen and reenact scenes from the rides, and then have a little home movie on a VHS tape that was presented by GVC. And they have obviously a bit where that you encounter King Kong on the ride, so they basically had a version of the tram that was on green screen that you could replicate, and they matched the shots pretty well. And I believe all the cameras for that attraction were camera controlled. And then later it was replaced with a Star Trek attraction to compete with the Star Trek adventure in Hollywood. And then eventually, once the Kongfrontation attraction closed, and then also it was also turned into an Islands of Adventure preview. And then once Kongfrontation closed, it became part of the lineup queue for Revenge of the Mummy. Now, the majority of the roars when I first made this were from both the ride, the original Kong, Toho Kong, and the 76 Kong. But since then, there have been better material out there to use some of the original roars used in the ride, so I tried to use those as much as possible. Now, during this time in 95, when they did changes to the ride, they also abridged it a bit more. For example, this scene here where the tram essentially stops as the power goes out and then turns a corner, and originally they were going to have it where you hear footsteps of Kong, and the police emergency frequency would say Kong is approaching your area. But in 95, they changed it. They took out the power bit, like the power outage bit, and the tram just kept going. As well, they added a bit, instead of hearing Kong's footprints, they had it where a flashing light from the chopper would blind the driver, and then when they turn it off, they would be cut off by Kong. So I don't know why a lot of these changes were made. I guess because, obviously, to save cost on money and essentially, like, keep the ride flowing at a faster pace. Maybe they had, like, a tram that pretty much went out, so they had a faster time to make all the action happen. But yeah, the Street Kong's pretty interesting. It was a lot heavier. Now, interesting enough, I know a guy who is a private collector who has some of the fur from the Street Kong, which is interesting, and he has stated to me that it has the constant smell of bananas and burning propane. Now, the banana part I understand because both Kong animatronics had a banana scent feature, which unfortunately Reign of Kong doesn't have, but when Kong roared at the guests, it would smell of bananas, so that's understandable. But the propane part, the burning propane, was due to the fire explosion in the back. So the puppet being that close, there was always a risk of a fire happening. So thankfully, the puppet never really burnt down. But some of the, again, some of the pieces were left there. Now, I will admit, like, as much as the chopper models are actual, like, full scale, they feel a little small in comparison to the choppers that take down Kong in 76, because they were full-on Huey H1 choppers. That's one of my favorite shots on the ride, is just the spotlights and everything, just showing the pure chaos that Kong is inhabiting. So whenever I think King Kong, I think an image like that. Now these are obviously new shots in the remaster, but they actually show Kong's pure ferocity, and it's actually kind of scary, honestly. Some of the reaction shots of people reacting to Kong were not just from the ride, they were also from the King Kong encounter. Now, technically, I shouldn't be able to do that, but I did have to kind of cheat to achieve the editing process. Now, back in the old days, when I edited this, I did use Pinnacle Studios, and I still use Pinnacle. But at the time, I wasn't thinking about HD because of memory. So some of the early version of this, I think, is at like 420, but for the remaster, I definitely had to put it in HD. But yeah, like, this animatronic, honestly, is pretty spectacular, to be honest. Like, like, his eyes especially are horrifying. Now, I think in later versions of the ride, like, especially around here, is when they made the eyes glow for some reason. I guess because they wanted to limit the lighting. But it just gives a much more devilish feel to the character. Now, also, if anybody who's even watching this, if you have, like, any information about the ride, definitely let me know in the comments. I always like to know, like, what happened to certain props and so on. This is also one of my favorite shots coming up right about here. I love that shot. That was from one of the original promotional materials when the ride was in full working order. Now, in the promotional stuff that they filmed, they actually had cops in the streets near the cars, and there's a bit where Kong will, like, knock two cops over, which I thought was pretty cool. Now, obviously, you could put this as well in the 1976 King Kong as kind of a side thing that happens in between where Kong goes over the Queensville Bridge and over the East River. And you could kind of actually add this into the film as part of the story. Because the whole thing is, like, everybody thinks it takes place in present-day New York, when in reality it actually takes place in 1970s New York. Now, without even mentioning Carl Denham or Fred Wilson, all they say is King Kong has escaped its captors. And that's kind of interesting that, like, they don't really mention who is exactly in charge of the animal, like, maybe, like, it was escaped in a cage or something, which gives a different, interesting take on the story. But one thing that's interesting about this ride is that at the time, they were hugely successful, the Encounter and Kongfrontation, that Universal in the early 90s thought about remaking Kong, and they had hired John Landis on as a director, and they were going to use the rides as a base of storytelling. And even there were rumors that were stated they were actually going to use the animatronics, especially the Florida one, to save money on creature effects, and that they were going to basically be using those and putting new backgrounds and stuff in later. But unfortunately, for some reason, John Landis left the project, and Robert Zemeckis, the producer, eventually headed over to Jackson, and then that took a deep shit show, and it eventually got made in 2005, a few years right after the ride closed. Now, some of the helicopter footage I unfortunately had to get from the King Kong encounter, because there doesn't really exist much footage of the actual choppers exploding. That's another great shot of just a camera turning back to see Kong making his final stand as you flee away from the attack. And obviously you come back unscathed, basically in a totally different station, even though it's pretty much the same thing, which is an interesting concept that they pretty much went in a circle. And that's obviously what they did, because it's a square building. The buildings were actually the size of 2 football fields, which is pretty interesting. That's a big building, essentially. And having been there several times, seeing that is probably the largest soundstage in Universal Studios Florida, just due to the fact that they had to house these 2 giant animatronics. Now, this is what was fun, is that what you would do is after the ride, you would see yourself on television being brave enough to stand against King Kong. And also, the ending music used here is from, obviously, the end of the original film when Carl Denham says the line, "It was beauty killed the beast," just to kind of replicate more of a sympathetic feel to Kong. So yeah, it was just essentially, it was really fun to kind of just put this all together and editing. I think I took a total of like maybe a year to make this video, even though it's only like 30 minutes. It was just more about finding all the right footage, putting them in the right places, and essentially creating almost like a movie in this tribute. There is a part of me that actually wants to do more of these tribute videos. Like, I've always wanted to do one for Jaws, but I feel like there's enough footage out there to basically make a full movie. As well as maybe something like Earthquake, E.T., Back to the Future. But even Back to the Future, you don't really need to make a tribute video to, because you've got all the pre-shows and stuff available on the Blu-rays. So yeah, like, it's still, in my opinion, one of the greatest attractions, one of my favorite rides of all time, and I'll always miss it. I'll never forget that ride. And obviously it was good to go back and do the credits here, because there was a whole prologue about the history of it, but there's so much now that you can find out about it that it was kind of pointless to add in the remaster. But yeah, it was just great to kind of do this credit scene with the John Barry score from the end of '76. And yeah, the gift shop. I remember the gift shop fondly. I remember like that, like the sort of bamboo fencing wall on the structure. It really reminded me a lot of, like, I really want to see a Kong movie where the wall is a pure bamboo fence. But yeah, apparently that bust is somewhere around, from rumors that it still survives and it's in a storage unit in one of the sound stages. I would love to have that poster, by the way. That'd be a really cool poster to own. But yeah, like, there's a part of me who wants to do more tributes. If you guys would like to see me do one, maybe for Jaws or E.T. or Earthquake, let me know in the comments. Obviously, it was great to kind of go back and find a lot of footage for this stuff. I love during the holiday season, they would put a Santa hat on Kong, and I thought that was actually pretty funny. They did that also with the King Kong encounter. So it was also great, like, when I was doing this tribute and other videos for Kongfrontation, I got a lot of people who I was able to interview who work at the parks who remember the ride. And they had some great stories to tell. I might put them in a compilation someday. So one last look at the gift shop. Thankfully, there's a lot of great videos on YouTube that show the gift shop a bit more. But yeah, guys, thank you so much for watching this video and this commentary during March of Kong. I hope you enjoyed this commentary, just seeing what went on to make this tribute video, as well as like a bit of the history of the ride itself. If you would like to join us on the Kongfrontation Facebook group, link below. But until the next video, guys, like, comment, subscribe, and I will see you guys later. This is BigJackFilms signing off, and long live Kongfrontation.